For those of you who have stayed, and it looks like a lot of you have, you're in for a treat. Let me introduce our closing speaker. So the closing speaker is Austin Fragaman, class of 1968 of this law school. He was the founder of the Case Western Reserve Journal of International Law 57 years ago. And he's told me the story of how this happened. He went to a conference. He heard way back then that there were just a couple of really elite schools that had international law journals. He came back to the dean at the time and he said, "Don't we want to be elite like them in our international law program?" Little did he know that 57 years later, we'd be ranked number 10 in the country. But a lot of that has to do with the strength of our journal, which he founded, and the dean at the time had the foresight to agree with him to create. We put copies of the journals on each of your tables. If you're an alum or anybody else, please take them home. We don't want to recycle them. We want them to go to your houses. Now, let me tell you some more about him. While he was in law school, he won the Jacob Hecht Award for the most pro bono hours as a law student. He built the largest immigration law firm in the world. He has been an adjunct professor at NYU School of Law. He has served as chairman of the New York City Bar Justice Center. He received our Alumni Association's Centennial Award, the highest award that can go to our alums. And for purposes of today's speech, he is currently the chairman of the Business Advisory Group on Migration of the Global Forum on Migration and Development. Please join me in welcoming Austin Fragaman. Thank you, Austin.
Could you, by the way, could you get me a little water? That would be great. Well, thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here at the school and in this beautiful building, and as you many of you are law students, and the rest of you have been on campus. It's quite a bit different than it was back when we were we weren't even really on the campus, right? We were on Delbert Street, and I think some of you are familiar with that. What I wanted to do in closing, because of my interest and involvement with the Global Forum on Migration and Development, which is a sister organization to the UN. It's made up of all the same countries pretty much that the UN is. And it's charged with really that interface between migration and development. How can you use migration as a development tool? And it's it's composed of ambassadorial level people from about 165 different countries. And one of the big issues that the GFMD has been working on for the last really 10 years is the impact of climate change on migration. And I'm personally the chair of the Business Advisory Committee. The GFMD calls it the business mechanism, because they basically have three categories or three groups of outside experts, you might say, to give them advice. One is civil society. The other is the private sector, which they call the business mechanism. So they have the civil society mechanism, the business mechanism, and the mayors mechanism. And the mayors are a conglomerate of mayors of usually cities of about 10 million people from around the world, who give the special input of problems that cities have dealing with migration issues. So it's obviously a pretty interesting organization. So with that, what I thought I'd do is just make a couple observations about, have to go this way, a couple observations about, migration and we'll call it, as they refer to it, it's really migration and human mobility is how we look at it. And I won't go into the impact of climate change on migration, because I think that's topic has been more than exhausted. But merely just to mention a few statistics, I was going through my papers trying to find things that no one said. Somehow or other we left this one out. But it's estimated that 22 million people get displaced each year, and that's by those are the figures of the UNHCR, the UN's High Commissioner on Refugees. And the other figure comes from the World Bank of the estimate of how many people will be displaced by climate change, and that would be displaced internationally. One of the big problems is the data problem when we take a look at climate change and what the impact is, because we don't really know how many people are displaced internally, how many return, how many are displaced permanently across international borders. And of course, we're really concerned about displacement across international borders, although that seems rather simplistic, and it was nice to hear some of the efforts that different countries are making, because those are very important. We mentioned, and it was mentioned, I think, very eloquently by the speakers, that the UN protocol on the status of refugees doesn't really help us. There isn't a climate refugee per se, but it really didn't recognize the climate threat at the time. But there is the Global Compact on Migration, and the Global Compact on Migration, as probably most of you know, is a non-binding cooperative agreement which addresses a number of issues. In fact, I'd say it addresses every issue you could possibly think of that deals with migrants. And if you haven't familiarized yourself with it, it's extremely interesting. There were most of the countries in the world signed this voluntary, non-binding cooperative agreement or approach. And it's really an approach because there also is the International Migration Review Forum. So basically, each country has to set goals, or I should say the UN really sets the goals under the compact, and then the countries report how they're doing against the goals every 4 years. And they just had their first report in 2022, which wasn't very elucidating because of the intervention of COVID. Pretty much destroyed normal patterns of migration in many ways, and therefore it was not as important as it should be. But the idea is that although it's a non-binding agreement, you're still accountable to the world community to go in and say what your country has done in that period of time. And we talked about the multilateral climate agreements and regional solutions, and the per country explanations were particularly helpful. Now we have a compact, right? So that's even something different than a treaty or an agreement or whatever. Obviously, being non-binding creates an obvious hole, you might say, in terms of enforcement or your level of commitment or responsibility, because vulnerable populations really need a comprehensive long-term solution, and we'll talk about that a little bit at the end. In the interim, we can look at some of the key elements of a solution. One of the major factors is that for any comprehensive program, you should have some sort of any comprehensive program should address not only admitting or regularizing persons that are displaced because of climate, but also what kind of benefits, what are the basic benefits they're going to receive. And theoretically, those would be uniform throughout the world. And we're talking about housing, at least for some subsistence for some period of time, right to education, et cetera, the usual litany. I think we mentioned that earlier today. In the GF, the Global Compact on Migration established several climate-related objectives that are particularly important. One is developing and enhancing existing immigration pathways. So we're setting up pathways for persons who are displaced. And the second is solutions for both slow onset and long-term onset adverse climate, anticipated adverse climate impacts that would affect entire populations. So it recognized the fact that there will be displacement of populations, and whether that's because of desertification or whether it's because of rising sea levels and making low-lying islands uninhabitable. It was very interesting in that it actually addresses that issue. Data is a big problem. The data is very incomplete, and I think we talked about that a little bit earlier as well, on the question of having enough data to really define what a climate refugee is, and I won't rehash that because I think our previous speaker did a very fine job on that particular topic. But there are a lot of elements and a lot of dimensions to it, and we really don't even know simple things like how many people have been displaced, the duration, whether they're coming back, whether it's permanent, et cetera. And you can imagine how would you get that information? It would be reasonably difficult, so it's no wonder we don't have it. But until we know more about the exact characteristics of this class, it's a little difficult to come up with a treaty or an agreement that goes beyond just talking loosely about people that are displaced by climate, as the Global Compact does. But there is another solution, which is which you may have heard quite a bit about. There have been a number of recent seminars and meetings dealing with legal pathways, and this has really been driven by the IOM, the International Organization on Migration. And the theory behind it is not only to create legal pathways, and creating a legal pathway would be, an example would be allowing persons from certain countries to make appointments to enter the United States even though they don't have any legal status, and then to basically say, well, that's a legal pathway of migration. So what we're looking here is something very different. Those legal pathways would be limited because they raise major public policy issues. But the role of labor migration is a really interesting aspect of this. And whether it's possible, to actually use traditional kinds of labor migration in a way that would really facilitate the refugees entering the country. And just to give you an idea, right now there are about 169 million workers that are working out of countries other than their own native country, right? And that's your pool of labor migration. And currently, just to give you a perspective on that, there are just slightly over 100 million people forcibly displaced in the world, and that includes internally displaced. And there are about 35 million refugees, just to give you an idea of numbers. So you can see that labor migration is a big pool, and it's growing. It grows at least 10% every year, and usually more. And there are opportunities to establish pathways for labor migration to meet the needs of people displaced by climate. Humanitarian groups partnering with the business community has successfully employed refugees based on skills and abilities, using existing labor migration structures. And that's something that's taking place right now, and there are a number of organizations. You may have read about them. For instance, the yoga, the company's called Tent. The nonprofit that resettles refugees is called Tent, right? And it's been very successful at doing this. Another one is Talent Beyond Boundaries, which has been conducting an experimental program, a pilot program in Canada, which is very interesting. In there, what's happened is, or what they're doing is, they've, in dealing with the Canadian government, what they've done is expand the criteria for qualifications in occupations that are eligible under this program, and allowing refugees to qualify for migration status in Canada with a lower standard than they would normally apply in general. And they're exploring that right now with 10 different occupations. And of course, what we're talking about here is setting up a structure where you can match skills and competencies of the climate migrants, in our case, with the host location skills gaps. So you're basically either trying to find employment specifically for refugees in particular jobs, or basically in studying labor market needs in a particular market, you can determine there's shortages of people in certain occupations, and then give refugees some priority in filling those needs. And of course, you don't really have to qualify necessarily as a refugee. The concept behind the using labor migration is it really can apply to anyone who's been displaced. Because we all know that the definition of refugee is a bit artificial, in the sense that the characteristics of someone who might be a refugee would be almost identical to another person who was migrating with the same general characteristics and background. Also, there are skills partnerships where private sector employers have offered jobs to migrants based upon their skills and training. And frequently, as you can imagine, retraining is necessary because the type of people who frequently, or the skill sets of the people who are displaced, frequently don't match up with the skills gaps that you have in the countries to which they may be wishing to move. So the program, and where these skills partnerships have worked well, is reskilling and training migrants for future employment in a country to which they'd be going, either training once they get there or training before they move. And that would be facilitated by establishing standards to measure competency and harmonize requirements for licensure and whatnot. That would facilitate that. And of course, this technology has been very successful that companies or organizations like this Talent Beyond Boundaries have used to match the skill sets of refugees with positions that are available in Canada. And finally, there are really some significant benefits to this, in the sense that we'll call them climate displaced people would be able to get jobs fairly easily, frequently in the green economy, which is expanding. Also, there's going to be quite an expansion of infrastructure projects, because we all know that the way to protect against devastating impact of climate change is frequently to have to take whatever measures you need to, which involves building infrastructure, dikes, walls, canals, dams, whatever it takes. And you can imagine, I'm sure you've all read about the problems with water supplies and things of that sort. And you can imagine all the technology and engineering that's going to go into trying to solve these problems. And there will also be labor shortages in the northern tier of the world, which is an underdeveloped area. A lot of it's buried under ice and snow, the global warming will have a residual positive effect in certain areas by making them more accessible for economic development, which will create a lot of new jobs. So the trick will be, well, all right, if we have all these people now who need jobs because they're being displaced, and we have all these jobs available, how do we match them up? And that's why the reskilling and training and education becomes a big part of it, and why those organizations need to be involved in it as well. And finally, demography favors this type of effort because, as you can imagine, the skills shortages are in developed countries with shrinking population, and high fertility rates are generally in economically underdeveloped countries, and many of those countries are the ones that are going to be most impacted by climate change. This is why this concept has really taken hold, although it goes without saying that it's very bold. Remittances are a major aspect of this because employment allows migrants to send money to people in their home country. The diaspora community is extremely important source of revenue and accounts for a significant portion of the GDP of many countries. And secondly, you have a particular role of cities because displaced people are more likely to go to urban areas than they are to other rural areas, obviously. So cities historically provided livelihoods for persons on the move, seeking opportunity, so you have a disproportionate number of people who go there. And cities have to be prepared for this. We can do a study of New York City. There's a city that is kicking and screaming and clearly unprepared, fighting about where to put up tent cities and things of that sort is what you don't want to have happen. Because the role of the cities is really to be able to support migrant families resettling, and most importantly, engaging youth, which is really imperative, so that they don't wind up in street gangs and things of that sort. So we need education, housing, healthcare, etc., as well as identity documents, work permission, etc. So finally, in concluding, what we're talking about here is developing a framework for migration and climate change, which is a massive undertaking. It can be done, iteratively. Obviously, it's not something you need to do that you do. If you don't, you need to do all at once. Canada has 10 occupations that they're doing this with, just to as an experiment, which is apparently working out very well from my meetings with them. And the effective solutions have to incorporate relocation, job placement, training, skilling, education. And the appropriate solution has to be devised for distinguishing between slow onset and sudden onset phenomena, and allowing the flexibility for persons who think they're just leaving because there's a sudden disaster or whatever, if they can't go back to their home country, to be able to stay. And because at the end of the day, the displaced can be a source of a solution to adverse effect of climate change through utilizing skills and abilities that the migrants possess. And through cooperative efforts of the private sector and government, skills mobility partnerships can help fill talent gaps in developed nations while helping to cultivate a new generation of talent to return to home countries. There's a certain circular migration aspect with the migrants manifest and eventually go back to their homelands with new skills and whatnot. And so there's something that's very encouraged. It's a big issue with the GFMD is how to encourage people to go back to their home countries after they have benefited from an experience in the host country. Meanwhile, civil society has to play a very active role to make sure there's decent work, fair employment, and protection of the rights of the migrants. But the world community, we need to develop a governance system, right, through a binding global agreement with adequate funding to address this challenge. So that's my thought for the day, and I hope if any of you have any questions, I'd be happy to entertain them.
Does anybody have a question? I know it's very late in the day, so I think we'll just close it there and let you have the last word.
Good idea.
Yeah.
Good.
So everybody, thank you so much for coming to our conference. Those of you who are panelists, Milena Stereo is taking you out to dinner to the Tacologist Mexican restaurant. Can you just stand up so everybody knows? Just follow Milena, she'll take you there. So, and the rest of you, thank you for coming. Thanks again to the students and to Eric Seiler and your staff for doing everything, including saving us from a fire. So, thank you.